What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more? Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? Want to know what Nietzsche meant, or why he thought we live our lives over ad infinitum? Every day, Moonlit, the daily literature app, curates one passage to explore. Search Moonlit Daily Literature on the App Store and use coupon code BTC 1 month free to get your first month for free. Again, that's Moonlit Daily Literature with coupon code BTC 1 month free. Today's episode is also brought to you by celebrated author and artist A. Kendra Green's No Less Strange or Wonderful, a collection of 26 sparkling essays illuminated through both text and image, from exploding sharks, trees riding bicycles, a Hollywood-esque balloon dress, a giant sloth in a costume, and a sentient bag of wasps. A. Kendra Green uses the seemingly everyday to make sense of what matters most in life: love, connection, death, grief, the universe, meaning, nothingness, and everythingness. Ben Fountain declares that what A. Kendra Green makes of the world, what she makes with the world, is unfailingly wondrous and revelatory. And Amy Leach cautions that this collection will take readers into the wild, trackless unknown. Each essay brings us back to our smallest and biggest moments in life and reveals that they are, in fact, one and the same. No Less Strange or Wonderful is available now from Tin House. Late in the conversation with today's guest, Michelle de Kretser, she says that one thing that unifies her work at large, work that otherwise is incredibly varied with regards to genre and form and how it deconstructs both, is that her work across her career interrogates power and abuses of power. And given that we are witnessing a stunning abuse of power right now, where really no one can predict how this will all turn out, I thought I'd spend a moment and highlight some contributions to the bonus audio archive over the years that speak to this moment, much as de Kretser's book, set in the 1980s, also speaks to us now. If you were a parent raising children during the first Trump administration, you surely still remember the name Betsy DeVos, the woman Trump appointed as Secretary of Education. When Lainey Zumas came on the show during this time to discuss her remarkable book, Red Clocks, she had just published an utterly blistering and goosebump-raising essay called Vos, Brie, Fend, Light. And in my dreams, she would record a reading of it for the bonus audio archive for us, which in fact she did. And in that spirit, Lydia Yuknevich's contribution was a reading of Zoe Leonard's landmark poem, I Want a Dyke for President. There's also Teju Cole reading Etel Adnan and John Berger, and a letter to John Berger that he wrote. Isabel Hamad reading from Walid Daka's Letters from Prison. And Vajra Chandrasekhara speaking about a Sri Lankan writer who was imprisoned for writing a story that was deemed by the government to be anti-Buddhist, where Vajra then translates part of the story for us and reads it. Access to the bonus audio is only one of many things one can choose from when transforming yourself from a listener to a listener supporter by joining the Between the Covers community. Past Between the Covers guest Anne DeMarkin, who wrote one of the best books of last year in my mind, she's also the head of a press called The Third Thing, which makes these incredibly beautiful books. The quality of every choice in their design feels like an act of love. And also, like de Kretser's books, they often cross and blur the borders of category and genre. The book she publishes trouble the relation between a performance space and the written page, for instance, or a lyric noir written by an evolutionary biologist. And she's put together bundles of these Third Thing books to offer supporters. There's also the Tin House Early Reader subscription, where you get 12 books over the course of a year, but months before they're available to the general public. But regardless of what you choose, every supporter at every level of support is invited to join our collective brainstorm of how to shape the show and who to invite going forward as well. And perhaps most importantly, every supporter receives a robust amount of supplementary resources associated with each and every conversation. You can find out more about it all at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And now for today's program with Michelle de Kretser. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is Michelle de Kretser, one of Australia's most exciting and groundbreaking writers. Her writing has been praised by everyone from Hilary Mantel to Ursula K. Le Guin, with Max Porter proclaiming her one of the living masters of the art of fiction. De Kretser was born and raised in Sri Lanka until the age of 14 when her family emigrated to Australia. She took her master's degree in literature in Paris and began a PhD at the University of Melbourne, where she co-founded the journal Antithesis. She was also one of the founding editors of Australian Women's Book Review. And ultimately, instead of pursuing her doctorate, she worked for a decade as an editor for Lonely Planet, founding the company's Paris office. But it was in 1999, with the publication of her debut novel, The Rose Grower, that began her storied trajectory as a writer, whose work is always shifting and interrogating form and genre, often circling questions of migration, colonization, gender, and race. For instance, whereas her debut novel was set centuries ago in the French countryside, as Paris was on the brink of revolution, her next novel, The Hamilton Case, followed the fictional murder of an English planter in Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, and the lawyer trying to solve the case. And her third book, The Lost Dog, follows an Indian-Australian professor trying to write a book on Henry James, but who becomes more preoccupied with finding his lost dog. Already at this point, 16 years ago now, her book stood out, winning the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the New South Wales Premier Literary Award, Book of the Year, the Tasmania Pacific Award, and more, with The Lost Dog longlisted for the Booker and the Orange Prize that same year. But it was with her fourth novel, Questions of Travel, that she leapt into another orbit, winning Australia's most prestigious book award, the Miles Franklin, and with A.S. Byatt proclaiming in The Guardian, quote, "This is a novel unlike any other I have read. Questions of Travel is about uprootedness and travel, about tourism and flight from terror, about the trivial and the terrible. It seems to proceed with an uncanny lightness in glimpses and sudden shifts. De Kretser is a master storyteller, and again prepares small and large shocks that explode tens of pages later and cannot be given away." Since then, she has written The Ghost Story, A Springtime, a second Miles Franklin winner with the novel The Life to Come, her book-length essay, part literary criticism, part memoir, on Shirley Hazard, and the formerly audacious Scary Monsters, which follows two Asian immigrants to Australia, one in the early 80s and another in a future Australian dystopia, where one story ends in the middle of the book and you must start again from the back, which now becomes the front, flipping the book over and upside down to reach the middle a second time. Michelle de Kretser is here today to talk about one of the most anticipated books of the year and one of the most unforgettable reads for me in recent memory, Theory and Practice, a book of which Singrid Nunes says, Theory and Practice is a thrillingly original hybrid work that seeks truthful answers to the most difficult questions of the day. Questions about the nature of love, art, and desire, about the thorny legacy of colonialism, and the unappeasable human yearning for connection. Jack Khalil for The Guardian adds, this appears to be de Kretser's impetus, to push the margins of what a novel can look and feel like. It also asks questions of the act of reading itself. This is a book of intrusions, of unacknowledged inequalities, of flawed maternal figures, of raw human emotions. So much is condensed into its brief length, not least of which is a probing interrogation of novels and why we write them. Finally, Neil Mukherjee says, Michelle de Kretser, one of the best writers in the English language, has written her most brilliant book yet. It is, in short, a masterpiece. Welcome to Between the Covers, Michelle de Kretser.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on the show, and thank you for that incredibly generous introduction. Thank you.
Well, you've described your own writing before as questing, jesting, testing. It is awe-inspiring to me how much of this happens in the first 15 pages of the book alone, the shifts in mode and tone that occur in those few pages. And I want to spend some time with what happens in the beginning. But before we do, I wanted to start with orienting listeners to our protagonist a little bit, who we learn about after this opening flourish. So perhaps we could start with you talking about how we first encounter our 24-year-old narrator arriving in Melbourne from Sydney with a scholarship to pursue an advanced degree in English. Who is Cindy? Where's she coming from? What academic dreams and curiosities does she have that propel her to Melbourne? And how does the reality of academia there surprise her or unmoor her from how she imagined it might unfold?
Yes, so the narrator is a young Sri Lankan Australian who's migrated to Australia as a child with her parents. Her mother is now a widow, and she's moved to Melbourne to pursue a master's degree in English literature, and specifically to write on gender in the late fiction of Virginia Woolf. And she goes along to Melbourne University, this is in 1986, and meets her thesis supervisor and is given a reading list of post-structuralist theory, where she was expecting perhaps a reading list about Virginia Woolf. And this is disconcerting, to say the least, to her, because she realizes that her undergraduate years are really no kind of foundation for the work she's now supposed to read and understand and incorporate into her own work, because she has never really encountered French post-structuralist theory until this moment. And just for the benefit of your listeners, I should explain that, you know, I believe in the Marxist principle of always historicize. So this is 1986, and in Melbourne, the charge of theory, which was led against Leavisites in English departments at Melbourne University, was very, very oriented towards deconstruction. You could read feminist criticism, Marxist criticism, anything you wanted to read, but the orthodoxy was deconstruction. So that meant Derrida, but also his American advocates, or US-based advocates like Paul DeMann, like J. Hillis Miller, like Jonathan Culler. And so this was a theory very much focused on the canon. Later on, as feminist theory really establishes itself in universities and post-colonial theory comes along, let alone in the 90s, queer theory and cultural studies, the focus shifts and the canon is profoundly questioned. But at this stage, it's really still very focused on mostly the romantics, right? Romantic poetry. And it's sort of exciting to our narrator that she has to embark on this whole new field of work and thought and philosophy, but also dismaying because she really feels that in some ways it has very little to do with her project. So there is that. She's intellectually disoriented, I would say. And then she makes friends in Melbourne, connects with various people, and she begins an affair with another student who is already in a relationship with another woman. He tells her that it's a deconstructed relationship, which seems to mean nothing except to him, to infuse it with an aura of cool, I suppose. And then as she reads further, does more background reading on Woolf, she is also rather disconcerted by something she finds in Woolf's diaries.
Yeah. Well, let's hold off on talking about those for a beat, but I think that's a pretty nice way to orient to the character. I'd love to spend some time with those few pages that precede us understanding who she is, because the book opens in this really wild way. At the beginning, it opens in a very traditional, immersive way. We're in what seems to be a novel. There's an Australian geologist protagonist who's in the Switzerland of 1957, who's captivated by a Spanish music teacher who herself is in London, a teacher whose family had fled Barcelona at the end of the Civil War. But the emotional core of this opening is his recollection from when he was 6 years old. And he's visiting his grandparents, their sheep farm in New South Wales, Australia. He seems to really love it there. He's captivated by his grandmother's rings. She shows him her collection, including the one most precious to her. But when he learns suddenly, abruptly, that it's time to return to his mother, he steals the ring and hurls it into the forest. A big search is conducted for the ring, and ultimately one of their native servants is accused of stealing it. And when his grandmother says she ought to be whipped, shivers run through the boy's body, but he says nothing and leaves as planned the next morning. As I'm reading these 10 pages, I'm, as a reader, very engrossed and interested and immersed. I'm all in. But then suddenly there is a rupture, a breaking of the fourth wall, with only one sentence by the author of this novel that goes, "At that point, the novel I was writing stalled." Then equally as abruptly, we are now with that author describing an essay from 2021 from the London Review of Books called Tunnel Vision, which looks at how an Israeli military commander was inspired by post-structuralist and situationist texts in developing his strategy of raids into the West Bank to further Israeli colonization. Then several pages later, much like her Australian geologist character in her stalled novel, the author thinks back to being a 7-year-old, recollecting piano lessons about music practice and music theory, and how the examiner for her music exams, as he tested her ability to enact music theory in practice, slips his hand into her underwear while doing so. And all of this happens before we settle in with Cindy in Melbourne with her thesis and thesis advisor in what is much more of a stable world and point of view. When you were touring with Scary Monsters, you talked about the purpose of the formal and structural element of that book, namely that there was no front or back and no right way to begin, and that you had to flip the book over on its head to begin the other half. One reason for this, you said, was that you wanted it to echo the way the migrant experience is one of life being turned upside down and the bewilderment that that causes. And the second reason had to do with the novel form itself, which is usually seen as a single, continuous narrative with a unity of time. In contrast, you wanted Scary Monsters to be radically discontinuous. So here again, in theory and practice, the novel form is ruptured by the author of it, and we quickly travel through several modes of nonfiction with this author as she ruptures the fictive spell. So before we talk about any of these parts on their own, talk to us about the gesture of this series or sequence of disruptive and disjunctive moves at the beginning of theory and practice.
Well, I guess I wanted to, as always, shake up the reader a little. We tend to consume novels effortlessly, don't we? I mean, and this is me. I love an immersive novel that just sort of slips down like eating something delicious and undemanding. But I feel that I want to question that way of consuming art, of consuming literature, that perhaps it should stick in our gullets occasionally, and cause us to think about what we're doing and what we are consuming, and to resist the easy commodification of literature. I am not sure about the United States, but certainly in Australia, realist fiction is the dominant mode of fiction. And I love a realist novel. I love an immersive read, but I want to also just disturb that from time to time to make the reader aware of the act of reading and of what we are reading and what the meaning of that is. I mean, one reason for having that opening in Switzerland is that it is, as you say, a conventional realist novel. And I feel that as a writer, I can do that too easily. And I'm suspicious of anything I can do easily. There is always the temptation with art to go back to what is familiar and feels safe. I don't mean that there is no work involved. Of course, I still, need to polish the sentences and so on. But it's basically, I'm at my seventh novel. It's basically something I know how to do. So I want to challenge myself above all as a writer in the same way I want to kind of challenge the reader, well, more so, really. And so I think I thought to myself, well, what is one way of making myself more uncomfortable and also kind of challenging the conventions of realist fiction? And I thought, well, showing them up as conventions is one way of doing that. So we can get into detail as we go on. But I would say that the novel, from the point that the beginning is said to have stalled, that the novel from that point on is what I would call a hyper-realist novel. A novel that doesn't read like a novel. Most of this novel, I would say 80% of it at least, is fiction, is pure fiction. But I wanted to give the impression of something that was perhaps diary-like, brief extracts from someone's personal journal, for instance, the whole Cindy story, I would say. And the purpose of having that beginning, well, one of the purposes is that when you say, well, this was fiction, and now I'm going to tell the truth, which is what the narrator says. I want to write a novel that doesn't read like a novel, and I'm going to tell the truth in order to do that. Well, the reader then immediately thinks that that must be true because what has come before it is called fiction. It is like placing black and white next to each other. Each appears clearer. But in fact, it is only a very heightened form of realism, what I'm calling hyperrealism. And to give you an example of what I mean by that, You mentioned the theft of jewelry in the first part of the novel, and the wrong person is identified as the thief and punished for it. Now, of course, this can happen in real life, especially where racism enters the mix. However, because realism must be plausible, okay, it must be credible. However, for us as readers, as individuals, to personally come up against that kind of miscarriage of justice is relatively rare. It's a heightened event. In the second part of the novel, jewelry also goes missing, and various explanations are put forward for what might have happened to this jewelry. But when we discover what has happened, the explanation is utterly banal. It's utterly trite. It's utterly everyday. It's something that all of us have experienced at some point in our lives and will, no doubt, in what's left of them. So you can contrast that heightened form of realism with what seems to be very factual, very understated, very unmelodramatic. Of course, that is also a convention. But as one of the characters, a very minor character in the novel says, right at the end of her husband, he made the mistake of confusing realism with reality. Realism is not reality, it is just another set of conventions. And I suppose that that's what I was gesturing towards. That's very
Well, no, that's I want to take that further, but I have a couple of questions I want to ask you, and then we'll loop back to this question of hyperrealism and realism because it's something that's comes up a lot. Maybe I'm attracted to this question myself. Maybe that's why I'm attracting certain books and certain writers of certain books. But before we go there, I was curious if the protagonist's stalled novel is the real beginning of a novel that you yourself tried to write and abandoned, or whether it was the beginning of a novel that you wrote on behalf of Cindy, knowing all along that it would stall.
Oh, the second.
The second one, yeah. Well, the reason why I wanted to ask this, beyond the fact that the book, I think, invites us to ask this, is that the Australian cover for the book, I think, is particularly and wonderfully provocative.
Yes.
And quite different than the American cover. The cover in Australia is a photograph of you from the 1980s, as if this book were simply about you, that we could collapse your story and Cindy's into one story without a second thought. But then below the photo, we see the subtitle, a novel. And I really love it because it makes me think of how fiction by women is so often framed and insisted upon as memoir, as testimony, or as personal and lived, as if a woman couldn't have done the work of imagining it. And yet you are literally framed on the cover itself, provoking us with your personal history. And I wonder, do you see theory and practice in this way, partly questing, jesting, and testing this gendered response to the imagination of women?
Well, yes, indeed. When the very brilliant designer of the Australian edition proposed putting this photograph on the cover, I was uneasy about it for exactly that reason. I should say that with my previous novel, Scary Monsters, that was the first novel written entirely in the first person for me. And one of the stories, one of the narratives in that book is narrated by a young Sri Lankan Australian woman working in France. And because I had worked in France at the same time, it was assumed by many people who interviewed me, for instance, this is unproblematically, a nonfiction. So I had experienced this already. I love the work of imagination. That is why I am a novelist. And I think that the work of imagination, people are afraid of it, suspicious of it. Of course, this goes back to Plato, right? And the banishing of poets from the Republic. I don't know why, really. But anyway, it was of concern to me. And then my partner said a very made a very pertinent point, as he so often does, and he said, "Look, you've written a novel with a female protagonist, and told in the first person. You could put a picture of anything you like on the cover, a polar bear, and people would still think,
They'd still think it
oh,
was you.
it's autobiographical, it's memoir," which is a good point. And I thought, well, it will. Thank you for raising this, because one of the reasons I thought it was a good choice of cover was that it gave me the opportunity to talk about these things in interviews. But the other reason that I love that cover is simply for, as you said, that provocation of the photograph with the caption, "The New Novel by." And when I looked at it, what it reminded me of was that famous Magritte painting, photorealist painting of the pipe, captioned, "This is not a pipe." So it could have been captioned, "This is not Michel de Kretser," really. And I think the designer, who, one of the reasons he's brilliant is that he's a very good reader. And if you think about it, a good cover, a smart cover, is a good reading of a novel, of a book, whatever kind of book it is. And I think Chong Wing-ho, who was the designer, had read perhaps what I just cited, that little bit where a character says, "Do not confuse realism with reality." You know, Nothing more realist than a photo of the author. Yeah.
Well, as you've already said today, that the book is perhaps 80% fiction, and in other places you said it's 15% essay and 5% memoir, though as a reader, we don't know one from the other.
No.
We're just reading. But one inspiration for this hybrid form was the topic of Cindy's thesis, Virginia Woolf, and something that she herself aspired to do in her late novel, The Years, but then abandoned, similar to your character abandoning their novel. But unlike you, Woolf abandoned her plans and reverted to the recognizable novel form, or a more recognizable novel form, whereas Cindy and or you abandoned the novel form for this indeterminate, hard to categorize hybrid form. But what was Woolf aiming to do, and to what end, when she was starting The Years?
Her initial plan for that novel was to narrate the story of a fictional upper middle class family over half a century. And each chapter of the novel would be followed by an essay, a chapter of nonfiction, discussing social changes that had taken place in the period just described in the novel, with a particular focus on changing attitudes towards women and changes in women's lives. She called this alternating between granite and rainbow, between facts and vision, which, beautiful descriptions of these things. I suspect that the reason she abandoned it was that it's a very schematic thing to do. And I mean, she wrote about 100,000 words, but, this strict division between chapter fiction, chapter essay, chapter fiction, it doesn't really suit Virginia Woolf, does it? She's a very impressionistic writer.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that very rigid form was probably not suited to her. Well, she decided it wasn't anyway, and so she wrote the Years as fiction, as you said, and she recycled much of the essayistic material into Three Guineas, the nonfiction book she wrote at roughly the same time. So I thought that, if it hadn't worked for Virginia Woolf, no way was it going to work for me. And that I would prefer to try this more, as you say, blurry tangle of forms. I think some bits it's quite easy to say, well, this is, obviously essayistic. The narrator herself says so when she's summarizing, for instance, the tunnel vision, the piece in the London Review of Books. But other times you don't know. And I think Well, negative capability. It's good to rest in uncertainty and learn to be comfortable with it.
Well, to 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 go back to the difference between realism and reality, or how one of the impulses of this book is to expose the conventions of and the artifice of realism. All of that provoked thoughts for me about one of the other main influences for this book. In the early pages, your protagonist says, as you've alluded to, an artist once told me that she no longer wanted to make art that looked like art. I was discovering that I no longer wanted to write novels that read like novels. Instead of shapeliness and disguise, I wanted a form that allowed for formlessness and mess. It occurred to me that one way to find that form might be to tell the truth. And this is something that I think about a lot. For instance, are we really telling the truth when we tell our lives with received forms? Telling our memoirs in 3 acts and double timelines, when we shape our lives to make them entertaining or propulsive or suspenseful to the reader, which I think you alluded to with hyperrealism. Isn't truth or life as it is actually lived in many ways anti-form, or even banal in what you were saying in the second theft of the jewelry? In other words, I agree that if she were to use truth as her guide, it would likely allow for more formlessness and mess, from which perhaps she could find a form that is all her own. And what's interesting about it, too, with regards to form and genre is that, as you've said here and in interviews, putting the hyper-realist novel next to realism highlights the artifice of realism. So thinking of reality and realism not being the same, I think not only of how the formal elements of how we tell a realist story don't really map to lived reality, but also how the realist novel centers the human, often one individual consciousness, how it banishes the non-human world to the margins or out of the story altogether, which isn't realistic. But to take it a step further than that, the realist novel often banishes the imagined and the fantastic, even though the imagined is deeply part of the fabric of every human life. That made me think of Ursula K. Le Guin, who once said, I think the imagination is the single most useful tool mankind possesses. It beats the opposable thumb. I can imagine living without my thumbs, but not without my imagination, which of course suggests that the imagination may be the most real thing or one of the most real things about us. I don't know if this is a question necessarily, but I bring up Le Guin here because in listening to you talk about theory and practice, I was delighted to discover that her essay, The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, alongside with Woolf's early attempts to write a hybrid version of The Years, is another primary influence on the book. But Le Guin's presence isn't explicitly obvious at all within the book itself. So talk to us about Le Guin and theory and practice, or the carrier bag theory in relationship to theory and practice. Anything about her and anything that it might have sparked in your imagination itself.
Thank you so much. I mean, one reason why Le Guin is not present in the novel in the way that Woolf is that I think the carrier bag theory of fiction, if I'm not wrong, dates from the late 80s. So it's not in the sort of the main part of the novel, although the novel does go beyond 1986. But another reason was that it wasn't until I first listened to this podcast, David, that I'm ashamed to say I hadn't encountered the carrier bag theory of fiction prior to that. And I heard quite a few different writers talking about it. And I immediately, procured a copy of it. But by this stage, I had already conceived sort of theory and practice, and indeed started writing it. I'd written all of the realist novel part and had just started on the rest. So it didn't lie at the very beginning of the book in the way that the Woolf novel did. But what was immensely reassuring to me after I read that essay by Le Guin was the idea of these different forms and different kinds of narrative all being able to coexist happily within the carrier bag of the novel. And as a writer, you especially if you're trying to do something that you haven't done before, as I was, you are anxious to some degree that will it make sense? Does it make sense? Are you just making a mess that doesn't reveal truths, that is just a mess? These anxieties attend upon any creative endeavor, I think. And so there was Le Guin's voice telling me that no, this was okay. Just keep going and you have your carrier bag of fiction. And I thought that was rather, I mean, rather wonderful. And I remembered, of course, back to Henry James, who described the novel as a baggy monster. And I thought, well, it can be a carrier baggy monster. That'll be what mine is, not sort of not large in volume, but holding lots of different kinds of narratives and not really focusing on one particular narrative. So it was both exhilarating and inspiring and reassuring, all of those things. And I'm very grateful to your podcast for bringing that to my attention.
Yeah, it's such an honor to discover that. And I also feel like the carrier bag, contrary to the way we're going to talk about how theory is employed in this book, feels like it's inherently generous and generative as an essay. Like it doesn't prescribe an alternate form to the received form. It feels like it keeps renewing itself in some sort of open-ended way.
It's a very important aspect of influence, I think, that as readers and critics, we tend to overlook, because as readers, when we talk about influence, we talk about generally what we're pointing to, because we can point to it, similarities of style, of content, perhaps a formal innovation. But I would like to cite something that Frederick Janison, the great Marxist theorist, said in an essay about influence. And he describes interviewing an East German writer, whom he doesn't identify. This is back in the day, obviously. And he asks this guy about the influence of Faulkner on his work. And the writer replies, oh, yes, yes. When I read The Sound and the Fury, I realized I could have a chapter of italics in my novel. Now, maybe this writer never went on to have a chapter of italics in his novel. Maybe he never did anything typographically unconventional. But what reading The Sound and the Fury did to him was show him a possibility. And so a very important kind of influence is simply opening the door to possibility, I think.
I do too.
And that is what, well, I suppose both the years and Le Guin's essay did for me.
Your protagonist says, quote, I began to see that my novel had stalled because it wasn't the book I needed to write. The book I needed to write concerned the breakdowns between theory and practice, and the material was overwhelming. Particles of it had entered my novel and jammed up its works. As a first step to talking about her crisis around both Virginia Woolf and her thesis on her, I'd like to spend a moment with the London Review of Books essay Tunnel Vision, which is the first thing she encounters when her novel stalls. And it's an essay that sets her on this other path of spelunking into the gap between theory and practice. And thinking of your hybrid genre book, it's also fitting that she talks about this essay because she notes that the essay, in all of its improbable truths, reads as if it were a fiction. I was hoping you could read that short section where she summarizes the Tunnel Vision essay.
In December 2021, an essay called Tunnel Vision by A.L. Weisman appeared in the London Review of Books. Tunnel vision read like fiction, but recounted atrocious facts. Its subject was the Israeli military commander Aviv Kochavi. At the Operational Theory Research Institute at Israel's National Defense College, Kochavi had encountered canonical works of post-structuralist and urban theory, including situationist texts. In 2002, Kochavi led a raid into the West Bank city of Nablus and Balata, an adjoining refugee camp. He directed his soldiers away from streets and alleys where they would be vulnerable to snipers. Instead, the Israelis crossed the territory through its buildings, battering holes in party walls and taking the Palestinian resistance by surprise. A Palestinian woman called Aisha asks us to imagine the scene. We're sitting in our living room with our family. Suddenly, part of a wall disappears in a roar. There's dust and debris everywhere, and soldiers shouting orders stream into the room through the hole. Their faces are painted black, they're in full battle gear, and their machine guns are trained on us. Our children scream and scream. Are the soldiers coming for us? Or does our house merely lie on their way to somewhere else? The answer comes when they smash a hole in another wall and move on to our neighbor's place. According to Weizmann, Kochavi attributed the success of the raid to his reinterpretation of space. He called it walking through walls and adjusting the relevant urban space to his needs. Weizmann suggests that Kochavi's strategy was inspired by the key situationist concepts of dérive and détournement. The first refers to unhindered movement through a city without regard for borders. The second to the adaptation of buildings for new ends. The tunnel strategy forced Palestinian fighters to abandon buildings for the streets, where they were easily hunted down. When they asked to surrender, Kochavi refused. The purpose of the raid was to kill as many people as possible in a short time before withdrawing. 70 Palestinians were killed by the Israeli Defense Forces in the attack on Nablus and Balata that day. The tunnel strategy went on to be copied by militaries around the world.
Been listening to Michelle de Kretser read a essayistic segment of Theory and Practice. Surely the situationists who were inspired by Marx, who meant their disruption not to be employed for colonization, but for busting through the walls of inequality, would have been likely horrified by this article, by this gap between theory and practice. Obviously, if your book took a binary stance one way or the other around theory, that theory was bad or theory was good, your book wouldn't be as good as it is. But nevertheless, it's quite unsparing when it comes to the potential damage of theory, fueled in large part by Cindy's anguish that she's no longer writing from love and desire. That after being given all these theorists to read as secondary readings for her thesis, she's finding herself at odds with the subject that she loves. Not only do we get this diabolical co-optation of radical theory, which then prompts her memory of being molested by her music theory teacher, but she brings us out to more of a general principle when she says, in 1986, critics applying theory to literary texts like to cast themselves as torturers. The text told a story, but that story was a screen. The critic was obliged to probe and interrogate the text in order to make it yield the story it was concealing. The critic always already knew every detail of that story, but it was necessary to make the text confess. Applying pressure to soft, secret places, the critic exposed fake oppositions, crude essentialisms, bourgeois hegemonies, totalizing mechanisms, humanist teleologies, squalid repressions, influential aporias, and many more textual fragilities. The text bucked and shrieked under the critic's ministrations, but the critic was merciless. Things always ended the same way. The text came apart, divulging its hidden significance. That was the story under the story. When it was revealed and the text was in pieces, the critic had won. I think there are many layers to why Cindy is feeling like theory is abusive, and or that she's being abused by the interjection of theory into her engagement with Woolf. But I can't help but wonder if one of these layers is related to how it is interfering with a certain type of reading experience, one that you've already referenced today. It reminded me of something you wrote in your book on Shirley Hazard, which feels in many ways to me like a companion book to this one. The epigraph to that book reads, "Works of art can be more important than anything critics can say about them." And you explore how Hazard's understanding of a work of literature requires, quote, "a submission akin to that of generosity or love." But I also think of two different reading experiences you have when you were reading Hazard. The first you describe as the greedy, gulping way you read The Bay of Noon, like a child devouring sweets, you say, where whole days were spent deep in fictional worlds. Quote, "It was reading as a form of enchantment, a way of reading I continue to value." But then when reading another of Hazard's books, you say this, "The Transit of Venus played havoc with my expectations of Hazard's fiction. Instead of immersion and enchantment, it encourages detachment and appraisal. It presents itself as Brechtian estrangement. Characters are often referred to by their full name. Sometimes they're merely the man or the woman. These cool designations foster observation rather than identification. We watch and assess the characters like people in a painting. The distancing operates even at the level of rhetoric. The narrative is steeped in irony, a trope that promotes seeing through rather than seeing with, a trope associated with disabused, not enchanted vision." And I wondered if you feel like our protagonist is partially rebelling against the ways theory is stepping between her and this experiencing of greedy gulping. If that is one of the ways she's rebelling, of being in whole days in fictional worlds, of seeing with. And you've already sort of mentioned that, and you were also interestingly using this food metaphor earlier about drinking something down or something being caught in your gullet. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about these two modes of reading, both of which you seem to admire, and how and why you think Cindy is buckling against this, and if part of it is a loss of a reading experience.
Yes, thank you so much. It's such an astute reading on your part. And yes, I think one of the reasons Cindy is disconcerted and disoriented is that she is realizing that she has to let go of some, at least, of that enchanted reading and really step back a bit from the novels of Woolf, which she does, of course. You know, when she finally writes an essay on Woolf, it is a disenchanted essay and one that uses theory. So I think I do still value that kind of immersive reading, and especially for certain kinds of books. I mean, I'm a great fan of the whodunit. That is my sort of guilty reading pleasure. And I absolutely loathe whodunits where whodunit is given away at the start. I want it to be a puzzle that, you know, I have to figure out along with whoever's investigating the crime, etc., etc. So that's a sort of generic requirement I feel must not be interfered with. While having written, you know, well, dare I say, sort of deconstructed whodunit myself in my second novel. But I think it is also the sense that what she knew, what was solid grounding in literature and literary criticism, has now gone. That's rubble underfoot. And she has to learn a whole new way of looking at and assessing and analyzing literary texts, one which is very challenging. And then, which she learns also can be a useful kind of tool for her. So it is partly about the making of Cindy as an intellectual as she grows into understanding different ways of reading literature and analyzing literature. And we might infer, although this is never spelt out, that this is where the seeds of her own interest in becoming a writer are sown, you know. But the other thing is also, I mean, there is a contradiction there, isn't there? There's kind of mess. It's not clear cut. She wants this immersive reading and then she shies away from it as well and uses another kind of reading to kind of get her revenge as she, on Woolf. And there we have again that contradiction, that mess, that gap, that complexity. And this is, I firmly feel, what the novel feeds on. That the novel as a form feeds on contradictions that aren't resolved, that perhaps cannot be resolved. And that out of this, art springs. It's certainly what interests me as a writer, so that Cindy as a character, for instance, is not entirely admirable. She indulges in some, well, what she would call shameful feelings.
Yes.
So, it's complicated.
Yeah. Well, much like you interrupt the fictive spell of the novel that you abandoned at the beginning, I want to interrupt the momentum we've created around looking at the book through a theoretical lens. Even though I feel like I could happily continue this way for many hours, I don't think it would do it justice to do that, justice to the actual experience of reading your book. In the 30-second video you did for Abby's bookstore introducing this book, you called it a book about love, sex, shame, and jealousy. And I think that gets closer to the experience of reading it. This book is obviously very erudite, but it is also very sexy and sexual. And I think of the famous line from Sontag's Against Interpretation essay where she says, in place of a hermeneutics, we need an erotics of art. But I'd argue that the eros coursing through this conceptual book might suggest that this is actually a false binary. Either way, one of the joys of this book and other books of yours are the love triangles and infidelities. And one of the ways the tensions between theory and practice plays out is through the lingering question of what solidarity one feminist owes to another when it comes to sex, to sleeping with another person's partner, and how eros is unruly and doesn't conform to what we think of ourselves. But thinking of the erotics of art, or the greedy gulping experience for you of reading Hazard's The Bay of Noon, I thought before we appraised Virginia Woolf, before we looked at the so-called story behind the story of Woolf, before we see through instead of seeing with, I was hoping we could begin by seeing with and have you talk to us about Cindy's experience of Woolf pre-thesis, why Woolf is important to her and perhaps to you, that would move her in the beginning to center her academic work around her writings in the first place, pre-deconstruction, pre-theory.
I think Cindy, as she says, has read Woolf when she is still at school, and specifically the book that has really sort of galvanized her and changed her thinking is the essay A Room One's Own. And she talks about this with various friends of hers in Melbourne, and the women say, oh yes, that was a book that changed my life. It changed the way I thought. the male friend she talks about it with, who's a young Marxist, says, well, she was just a product of the upper middle class, and she wasn't interested in working class reality. But the women are galvanized by Woolf's understanding of, experience of, and analysis and critique of gendered roles in her day, of Victorian patriarchy, really. And then we presume also that Cindy has read fiction, has read Woolf's fiction, and finds there, descriptions of female interiority that immersive and respond to her experience of being a woman. So, that is both in the essay A Room One's Own and in Woolf's fiction. It's fiction that is centered on women's lives. I should just also say, you mentioned Hazard and the Bay of Noon, and of course it occurs to me that only now that in that book and in The Transit of Venus, the female protagonist sleeps with another woman's partner.
Oh,
It's actually her friend's partner. I mean, the friend has gone off with someone else, and then she has a brief but intense affair with Johnny, who's the friend's long-standing partner, lover. And in the Bay of Noon, there's this wonderful scene where Caro sleeps with a man who is engaged to a British woman, not a friend of hers, I might add. But they're in the topmost room in a house, and they've just had sex. And his fiancée turns up in the driveway and sounds her horn. And he, hastily puts on a shirt and rushes to the window and says, I'll be right down, darling. And Caro just comes up and stands beside him. And Hazard says she was wearing nothing but a watch. And so, it's this sort of wonderful display of herself,
yes.
and claim, but it's clear what's been going on. So, in fact, both these novels, which have been important to me, have also, contained this infidelity.
It's interesting. So in an interview you did with the Right Around the Murray podcast, you really lit up and became particularly animated when you were asked a question about syntax, punctuation, and the poetics of the sentence, where you said all sorts of really interesting things, like how you like to end your books and also sections within your books with monosyllables, for instance. And of course, this could explain some of your attraction to Hazard as a writer, but I also would imagine to Woolf. It certainly was for Le Guin, who wrote often about Woolf. In one of my conversations with her, I quote to her something that she had said in a speech. This is Le Guin's words. Beneath memory and experience, beneath imagination and invention, beneath words, there are rhythms to which memory and imagination and words all move. The writer's job is to go down deep enough to feel that rhythm, find it, move to it, be moved by it, and let it move memory and imagination to find words. When I read this to her, she answered to my reading, quote, that is something that I learned from Virginia Woolf, who talks about it most wonderfully in a letter to her friend Vida. Style, she says, is rhythm, the wave in the mind. The wave, the rhythm are there before the words and bring the words to fit it. I'd love to hear you talk about this aspect of writing for you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. And I mean, I so agree with Le Guin and before her Woolf about rhythm preceding language. I suppose, the child, the fetus in the womb is aware of the murmur and the flow of the mother's blood, and then the mother's heartbeat, the rhythm of the heartbeat. And I certainly know that I have sometimes volunteered in aged care residential homes and worked with residents who have dementia. And these people, without exception, remember songs and nursery rhymes from childhood and can recite these to you perfectly, whereas they can't perhaps sustain a conversation that has meaning. So yeah, it's very primal, I'd say. Sometimes I have actually found myself having a rhythm in my mind and writing a sentence to fit that. I remember this very clearly, most clearly, I think, with my novel, The Life to Come, which was a time where I was walking my dog every day for long walks. And walking is, of course, a rhythmic activity. And those rhythms were in my mind a lot. And I'd actually come home and then write some sentences that seemed to fit. Or sometimes I'd just have a word that was missing, and the walking helped to, help me to find that word. I really do think that rhythm is incredibly important. I learned by heart a lot of poetry when I was a child. And what nicer way to learn anything than by heart, through love. And this tended to be in old poetry I found in old-fashioned anthologies. So pretty much exclusively poetry in formal meters. And I think, it was a very good foundation in rhythm and meter and helped develop my ear from an early age for sound in language. Often poems that I didn't necessarily know the meaning of every word, but the meter was there. And every time towards the end of a book, I would read the whole thing aloud to myself to try and, fix awkward rhythms. Also, while I'm writing, sometimes I'm just going to, see if it's working on the page. I started my professional life as an editor, and I think that a lot of editing focuses on the structural aspect of fiction. I think you can do an an awful lot at just the level of the sentence. If you just look at the sentences, this is, of course, the famous Gordon Lish principle. But I have worked with writers where I have really just encouraged them to look at every sentence and take out anything that isn't strictly necessary. And that has an immensely lightening, aerating effect on narrative. It doesn't mean that you can't have elaborate sentences, but you don't have anything that is unnecessary. And of course, the writer determines what, they believe to be necessary, not the editor. But everyone I've talked about this with has found it a liberating principle. And I try to apply it to my own work, although I'm quite sure one of the reasons I'm slightly hesitant about reading my own work is that I feel I'll be reading it and I'll think, oh, I should have taken that out. I should have taken that out. But certainly one principle I have adhered to is ending a novel, or a novel, let's say, with a monosyllable, a stressed monosyllable. So in this novel, In Theory and Practice, it's, but all that was the past. The lost dog, Tom said, I won't let you fall. It has an air of finality, a stressed monosyllable. It's a good, strong form of punctuation. It's the rhythmic equivalent of the full stop, what you call the period. So I rather like that. I think, endings are important. Endings are what a reader takes from novel most strongly, I think. But to go back to sentences, I mean, what is a narrative? What is a novel except a collection of sentences? On bad days, I tell myself, I'm not writing a novel, I'm writing a sentence, you know, and then I'm writing another sentence, and then I'm writing another sentence. It makes it manageable if you think about it in those ways. And if you fix the sentences, you fix everything. And, I ask people to trust me on this. You fix character, you fix dialogue, you fix plot to the extent that you have a plot. Work on the sentences, just fix the sentences. Yeah, and that is, you fix style. I mean, everyone, especially newer writers, are preoccupied with style. What is style? How do I work on my style? Work on your sentences. The style will follow.
Oh. Well, as a first step towards looking deeper at Woolf, we have a question for you from the novelist Neil Mukherjee, whose most recent book, Choice, is itself engaged with form in relation to reader expectations, where the book can be read as a novel or 3 standalone stories. With Sam Sachs for the Wall Street Journal saying, Mukherjee sacrifices the readerly satisfaction that comes from dramatic payoffs. Instead of providing pure narrative, he creates a dialectic, pulling the reader into these problems with a seriousness and technical excellence that makes a lot of what is published today seem immature. Choice asks much of us readers, but for all its pessimism, it trusts us to be up to it. And Jonathan Lee, in a rave review for the New York Times, Mukherjee is brilliant at tracing the ways a choice deferred becomes a fate sealed, but the book's tripartite structure is even better at showing how we graze one another's lives with our decisions, some of which may be catastrophic for our conscience, but beneficial for our art. So here's a question from Neil.
Michelle, this is Neil. This astonishing new novel of yours, so fiendishly intelligent, questions the whole project of what is now fashionably called autofiction, as if it's something ravishingly new, when the truth is that it's been with us for a very long time. You play with the idea of reality and representation in such dazzling ways. My question is now about Virginia Woolf, who plays a very key role in the book. I want to ask you about the ways your protagonists work on Woolf and her discovery of, let's say, certain things about Woolf, how that mediates the life-fiction pairing that is at the heart of your novel.
Oh, thank you, Neil Mukherjee. A great question from a great, great writer. So I would say that when the narrator of my novel reads Woolf's diaries, she finds an aspect of Woolf that she was not aware of, and which really undermines her faith in Woolf and shakes her admiration for Woolf. Woolf's life and Woolf's art, she's been revering the art, and now she comes up against an aspect of the life that she can't stomach. And this is an entry in Woolf's diary where she describes the visit of a Sri Lankan, a Ceylonese man, to her house to meet with her husband, Leonard Woolf, over afternoon tea. And Woolf describes the man in very disparaging, racist terms. This man was an independence activist and had come to London along with other Ceylonese activists to protest an injustice that had taken place in Ceylon, which was a British colony at the time. And Leonard Woolf, who had served in the colonial administration in Ceylon before he married Virginia, was helping these men with their case. So the narrator is utterly thrown by this discovery. And I suppose we get back to that question, which seems very much on people's minds, on readers' minds and critics' minds at our present moment, of how do we reconcile unpleasant aspects of creative people with the brilliance of their creative product. Actually, if I could digress, the exemplary writer here for me is not Virginia Woolf, but it's V.S. Naipaul, whose politics were, how to put it, despicable, really, and yet was a great, great writer who articulated the never before articulated experience of millions of people in his writing about immigration from the global south and colonialism and what colonialism had done in those countries of the global south. So, how do we reconcile the person and their art? Well, I don't know that we need to reconcile them. I think we need to acknowledge that these gaps, these messy gaps exist. I mean, Woolf, in her fiction, is trying to represent the interiority of women's lives and the difficulties of being a woman in Victorian and Edwardian Britain. And these were things that she knew firsthand. She had experienced Victorian patriarchy, and she could write about these convincingly, movingly, empathetically, wonderfully, really. But she wasn't able to extend that empathetic, compassionate seeing into the lives of the Ceylonese activist, which is odd for someone who was married to Leonard Woolf, who was absolutely admirable in that respect. But there you are. We all have our limits.
Yeah.
And as for the question about representation in theory and practice itself, well, yeah, I mean, all fiction, you could say, is at some level a quest for mimesis, isn't it? How to represent the world as truthfully as possible. And that might be through fantasy. You're still representing something very truthful about the world, as Le Guin, of course, demonstrates in her work. It goes back, I think, to the hegemony of realism, which is now pretty much seen as the only lens through which truth can be revealed. The truth about life can be revealed. And yet realism is a relatively new mode, isn't it? The same character in the novel who says, don't confuse, or berates her husband for confusing realism with reality, also refers to Bovarisme, which is very much a gendered term. It originates, of course, with Madame Bovary and Flaubert, very near the beginning of realism as a mode, was his mission, really, to make the realist novel seem as close to life as possible, and also give it great beauty so that it might unseat poetry as being, the highest genre in those very hierarchical terms that operated in the 19th century. So, he polishes his style, he works on his style, and he takes aim at romantic fiction, the mode that precedes realism and was the dominant mode when he was a very young man. Emma Bovary in the novel, of course, famously reads nothing but romantic fiction, tries to live her life according to its precepts, comes to a sticky end. And so Bovarisme has come to mean, romantic, foolish delusions, and is applied to women, basically, because men are, of course, realists. But realism is also a set of conventions. Yeah. So that is what the theory and practice is also trying to unpick.
Well, as you've already said today, that all these discoveries are happening in her diaries, far less so in her published work. And Theory and Practice details some of this around Woolf, what you mentioned, but also that she hated marrying a Jew, calling her husband in his presence the Jew. But even what is detailed in Theory and Practice around this and the Sri Lankan only scratches the surface of what is outside of the public eye, whether her hating the sound of Jewish voices or the ways Jews laugh to the donning of blackface is part of what's called the Dreadnought hoax. But it does break into her fiction a little too. For instance, the Jew in the bath in her book The Years, who's a man down the hall on the other side of the wall who shares the same bath with the lodger who's trying to entertain someone in a room and can hear the coughing and snorting through the thin walls, where she comments to her guests that there'll be this line of grease around the bath the next day and hair, where there's this palpable physical revulsion and this portrayal of an almost like animalistic figure, uncivilized and perhaps uncivilizable, that doesn't feel that different than the language the Israeli government now uses to describe Gazans.
Yeah.
But understandably, Cindy is most unmoored as she discovers the ways Woolf's life intersects with and portrays South Asians. And I was hoping you could read another little section that sort of, I think, captures her in this indeterminate, contradictory state of love and assessment.
So this is having discovered the passage in Woolf's diaries. She's going around to her friends seeking reassurance. I asked Auntie if she'd read A Room of One's Own, and she asked if the Pope shat in the woods. That book explained my life. That's what I thought when I read it. It explains the life of every woman on the planet. I asked Lenny if he'd read A Room of One's Own. He said that Virginia Woolf was a product of the British upper middle class and that her book was addressed to women like her. She knew nothing about working class lives. I asked Shaz if she'd read A Room of One's Own. She said that it had changed her life. Virginia Woolf was like my mother, if my mother had been like I wanted. I thought about her, our Woolf mother. She was our Bildungstheorie, showing us how to understand ourselves in relation to the world. Our mothers closed doors in order to keep us safe and never stopped warning us about the dangers outside. The Woolf mother said, imagine, and opened doors in our minds. She was the one we turned to when our own mothers failed. Our mothers failed because, 1, we were obliged to ignore them. 2, we kept presenting them with our pooey nappies. 3, they didn't have £500 a year and a room of their own in a Bloomsbury Square. The Woolf mother outed herself as a snob and a racist and an antisemite, failing us because mothers are obliged to fail. But her writing about women inspired us and gave us courage because our imaginations were bigger than hers. Our imaginations projected us into sentences intended for upper middle class English women. They propelled us into a future in which we were artists and scholars and our lives were experimental adventures. In that future, we could destroy the Woolf mother, rip her to pieces, and end up motherless and weeping. Or we could frame her, put her up on a wall, and keep her under glass. Theory had taught me wariness around either or, so I came up with a different solution. Acknowledgement lay between denial and tearing down. Very carefully, I slid a table knife between the wall and the 4 blobs of blue tack holding up my poster of the Woolf mother. She came away undamaged from her location above my desk, and I repositioned her on the dark wall behind my front door. Now that she was cornered and her eyes were level with mine, Her downcast gaze was that of a naughty child, unable to look her parent in the face. My bathroom was at the opposite end of the hallway. It didn't have an extractor fan, and the window was warped shut. Steam from my shower, escaping into the hall, kept unsticking the Woolf mother. But she always contrived to hang on by a corner or two.
Been listening to Michelle de Kretser read from Theory and Practice. I love that scene with a thin thread of comedy going through it too, I think, in the heartache and heartbreak. Thinking about Cindy's angst around a critique of theory, I wonder if the questions in the book aren't simply about theory and practice, but also about the practice of theory, both who is practicing it and to what end is it being practiced. Because when Woolf calls the Sri Lankan visitor a mahogany-colored wretch with the likeness of a caged monkey, eventually Cindy is inspired to include Sri Lanka in her work on Woolf. And she also wants to focus on an Indian character in the years who's given no lines, who's rendered a non-speaking figure. Something you would think would be an embraced approach, as taking a small detail on the margins as a way into a deconstruction of the text is the modus operandi of the day. But people are not interested in her pursuing this anti-colonial mode. And it made me think of two things. I don't know if they are actually related, but one was her noticing that all the Marxists on campus are men, and that when she goes to see the Australian film My Life Without Steve, an essay film, much like the book is sort of an essay novel, a feminist film that opened up possibilities for what art could be for Cindy. When discussing it with the man she is with, he focuses on something that seems truly insignificant in the film. Not a key, some men and some boats, in a way that seems to derail what is powerful about the movie. She even describes it as if he's taking a knife to a painting, which made me wonder if the subtext of noting the preponderance of male Marxists might be that Marxism in this context might be a way for a certain type of campus man to stay at the center of things too. Whereas in contrast, Cindy's desire to center this non-speaking Indian man feels much more generative, a project that could be illuminating about Woolf in many ways. That who is doing the theory, down or up a vector of power, and to what end might be just as important as what they are supposedly doing within theory. And Cindy seems particularly well equipped to wade into the complexities of this. I love that part about the liberatory aspect of Woolf around her jettisoning the afternoon tea ceremony, this obligatory woman-conducted daily ritual. But at the same time, Cindy commenting upon the, quote, ongoing immiseration of the tea pluckers, the former made possible by the latter, by the exploitative colonial practices that underwrote British progress and wealth. Where Woolf is disrupting the tea ceremony in one way, but couldn't have written this way without the tea pluckers who don't rise to human regard in her world. I don't want to be reductive and suggest it takes both Cindy's love of Woolf and Cindy's experience as a South Asian immigrant to be able to hold Woolf in this complex position. But it does make me wonder if the male Marxist comment and the thick-headed takedown of the film My Life Without Steve by a man were pointing at agendas being played out via theory that weren't really about theory. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, certainly that was my experience of theory in the mid-80s on that campus. There were also a certain kind of theorized man who described himself as a feminist and used this to sexually exploit students and women more generally. So yeah, I mean your comment about, this was a way of men staying at the center of the world, of the picture. I think that's an ongoing project for men. I don't think it's ever really stopped, although feminism has tried to disrupt it in various ways. I think this other salient point here is that in the mid 80s, feminism is working hard at trying to disrupt the male canon in universities, and therefore is really resistant to any critique of its great female writers, for example, Virginia Woolf. So the narrator's supervisor, who is a feminist, it really just does not want to hear the narrator's concerns about Woolf's racism and anti-Semitism. She sort of brushes them away. So this changes later on, of course, and post-colonial theory, the introduction of post-colonial theory into university English departments really shifted the discourse around race. But it's a very male-centered universe, the one that Cindy encounters in the university. I would say a very power-centered universe. And theory is a form of power. If you have, this is theory with a capital T, French post-structuralist theory. If you can talk that talk, you are powerful within the academy. So while, for instance, a thinker like Foucault and his critique of power is pointing out that all institutions are complicit with power, the will to power, everyone, all these theorists would pay homage to that, yet in their practice, they are busy securing their own positions by, well, basically through humiliation and exclusion. So they are very much deploying and practicing power. And it's always, of course, aimed at those who are vulnerable, students, women, the precariously employed, and so on. Though, within the university departments, there's a whole lot of messy gap between theory with a capital T and, practice.
Well, you've sort of already, through the course of our conversation today, answered my next question, because I feel like because of what time period this book is set in, the position around theory is one that's mostly critical of it, but it's before anti-colonial and decolonial reading practices have, as you've just said, have come into it. Because one of the things I wanted to bring up was how, for me, the experience of theory hasn't been one of torture, but one of that's often felt liberatory, like the impulse of Cindy that is discouraged to look under the surface in an anti-colonial way around Woolf. I think of conversations I had with Elaine Castillo about her book, How to Read Now, and with Dion Brand about her book, Salvage Readings from the Wreck, both which advocate a praxis of reading and rereading that is not greedy and gulping, but more in the manner you describe of reading Hazard's Transitive Venus, a scene through instead of a scene with. And depending upon the text, I often find this approach to be a form of liberation. You lose the magical feeling of the greedy gulping. Some of my favorite reading experiences remain these greedy gulping experiences, but I do think you gain something else. And I'm halfway through this 8-week course right now with the Australian psychotherapist Leah Avenay, who's also the Indigenous pedagogy lead at the Willan Center for Indigenous Arts and Cultural Development. The class is called Fieldwork, Collective Recovery from Colonial Fragmentation Disorder. And one of the terms that she uses in it that I really love is her notion of what she calls learning injuries. And that part of the work is working to heal learning injuries. And to me, when I think of Dion Brand returning to the books of her childhood where the Black characters were either absent or on the margins, they were silent or sources of ridicule, and where on a second read of Jane Austen or Thackeray, she discovers the oblique, euphemistic references to how their lives are upheld by There are plantations on the islands. But the first time through, she is enlisted, if uneasily, and in a way one can't quite articulate, into being with and alongside and in allegiance with a protagonist who at best would have no regard for her if she were in the book. That the ways you have to contort who you are in relation to the world of the book when you gulp it down do feel like they have the real potential through repetition to injure. That this other way of reading gives you back a sovereignty in relation to the text in a way, or a maneuverability that is different than the way the author themselves intend to maneuver you. And I guess I wondered if you had any further thoughts. You've already touched on this some. Your book allows for an enormous amount of maneuverability, I think, which I love. But do you have any thoughts about the gap between theories, essentially? Because it's not just about theory and practice or the practice of theory, but it's also perhaps this moment of time, as you've suggested.
Yeah, I think that it was a time, we're talking about me personally, I'm not sure about Cindy, but where I was starting to discover theories that I found, as you did, immensely liberating. I still remember the excitement of reading, The Mad Woman in the Attic, for instance. And you never look at Jane Eyre the same way again. But of course, there had been, prior to that, Jean Rhys and White Sargasso Sea. So, a novelist had already done that, really. And then, of course, reading Said and reading various Marxist theorists, and Marx himself. And Freud was immensely useful to me. And these were all exciting new ways of understanding the world, not just literature, but the world, But yet, I would say that for many people, not just me, that encounter with capital T theory at that particular time, in that particular place, was a learning wound in itself, was injurious in itself.
Yeah.
And interestingly, when I was touring theory and practice here, there were often people who'd been at university with me at the same time in the room. And one of them said to me, I think of us as survivors,
Wow.
Look, I take responsibility for my acts. I left my PhD because I realized that I didn't really have a scholarly brain. I have a novelist's brain. I have a magpie brain that goes and picks shiny things from here, there, and everywhere, and then makes them into something. But I can also think of if I'd been 10 years younger, I might have finished that PhD because I would have come to a different environment and found it more conducive to ways of understanding and reading literature that I was comfortable with. I mean, well, the real reason I left was I discovered editing, and it was so immensely satisfying to be able to fix up sentences. But I think it was, I love that phrase, recovering from, was it learning
injuries? Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And I can completely understand. I mean, if I feel alienated, it's almost impossible really to conceive the extent to which an Indigenous Australian would have felt alienated, and possibly still does within, university contexts.
Yeah.
Not to mention Middle Eastern students feeling deeply alienated by institutions at the moment. So the learning injuries go on. I don't want this book to be seen as, I completely understand that it is seen as anti-theory, but it's important to understand that it was a particular kind of theory at a particular time.
I wouldn't say that I would characterize it as anti-theory, but just more that it's leaning more towards that direction than the other.
Yeah. Although, right at the end there is, or towards the end, there is Cindy deploying theory in ways that are satisfying,
I think so,
and
too.
liberating.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we have two more questions for you from others. The first is from my fellow podcast host, the co-host of the podcast Fiction Nonfiction, the writer Vivi Ganeshananthan.
Wonderful.
She's the author most recently of the novel Brotherless Night, which was winner of the 2024 Carol Shields Prize and also the winner of the 2024 Women's Prize for Fiction. She is also the former vice president of the South Asian Journalists Association and a current member of the boards of the American Institute for Sri Lankan Studies and the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop. So here's a question for you from Sugi.
Hi, Michelle. I'm a huge fan of your work and have been for many years. David, thank you so much for the invitation to ask a question. I first encountered your work when I read The Hamilton Case, an experience from which I still haven't really recovered. And I'm interested in how impunity and its consequences appear in your work and have appeared in your work over the years, because that seems to me like something that stretches from your earliest work to your work now, even as it has changed wildly in its approach to things like form and genre. That seems like a common emotional theme. In the Hamilton Case, of course, the book appeared to me as a younger reader to be a mystery, and then turned out to be something so much larger and astonishing, and really having a lot to do with that. And in Theory and Practice, there is, even at the very opening, a scene that gestures at the intersection of innocence and impunity. And yeah, I would just love to hear you discuss this. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. Wonderful question from another really wonderful writer. I guess I hope that all my work in some way takes aim at the abuses of power of one kind or another, whether that is state power, institutional power, or the power that is deployed between individuals. And I hope that it is always on the side of the powerless and tries to reveal the forms of abuse that are practiced on them. And yes, sadly, there is often impunity for perpetrators involved. But I think it is the quest of the purpose of art to hold power to account. And that is what I try to do.
Well, our next question comes from novelist and critic Mireille Jushore, whose last novel, The World Without Us, was longlisted for the International Dublin Literary Award and the Miles Franklin, shortlisted for the Stella Prize, the Christina Stead Prize for Fiction, and winner of the Victorian Premier's Literary Award. The Australian said of The World Without Us, a bright, bracing marvel of a book, her prose is a marvel of balance, witty and sensual, self-aware but not jaded, incapable of making poetry from anything. So here's the question for you from Mireille.
Hi, Michelle. It's Mireille here. Theory and Practice has so many compelling passages about the blurred lines between truth and fiction. I found it intriguing to think about how the choice of genre in turn shapes the selves described within it. So, for example, in a passage on Virginia Woolf, you write, "Did Woolf's diary represent oneself, while her fiction and essays represented another? If her diary expressed private thoughts and her books expressed public ones, did that mean that her diary self was the true one?" These categories, fiction, diary, essay, non-fiction, are to some extent imposed on us by marketing and publishing conventions, as much as freely chosen by the writer. So how did you establish for yourself what the parameters of this work would be during the writing process? A second part to this question is about the freedoms that some theoretical texts seem to offer the narrator. So Cindy repeats that indelible line from Roland Barthes' A Lover's Discourse, "Who will write the history of tears?" She's troubled when theories are imposed on a work to wrest the narrative's supposed true meaning. But while writing the book we're reading, she also suggests that writers create their own theory by finding a unique form for each work. That practice produces its own theory. Cindy's relationship to theory seems like a really productive ambivalence in this way. So I'd love to know whether theory enabled or limited how you came to write your earlier works, which often played with form, and this latest book, which feels like a more radical departure.
Thank you. You have found so many wonderful writers to ask me questions, really brilliant people. And I'm very touched and honored that they've read this book and engaged with it. So the second part of Mireille's question is about ways in which certain kinds of theory helped me write my earlier books. I think simply that certain theories, as we were saying just earlier, have given me new ways of understanding the world and seeing how it operates, analyzing its operations. So, feminist theory, Marxist theory, post-colonial, decolonial theory, Freudian theory. What hasn't stayed with me, and which I don't think has proved useful very much in the decades that followed the 1980s, is deconstruction. I mean, it might be helping people to think things in a certain way, and I suppose it does in that sense that the narrator uses it in theory and practice, where she's wary around these absolute alternatives, these either ors. You have to choose between rejecting Woolf completely or admiring her unreservedly, and she wants to find a more nuanced way. And perhaps, that is the way of literature, to look for nuance and shade in what seems to be black or white, to explore the mess. And as for the questions about form, yeah, I think absolutely that each new work suggests its own form or imposes its own form. And that might be a deconstruction of a conventional genre like the whodunit or the ghost story, another form that interests me greatly. Or it might be this undoing of forms entirely, or not undoing, but trying to resist that imposition of, is this true? Is this not true? Is this fact? Is this fiction? Which, as we were saying, the cover of the Australian novel gestures towards. And yes, I completely agree that to some extent these are conventions imposed on literature by conventions of bookselling and publishing, so that books in bookshops are classified as, fiction, or in one of many different categories of non-fiction, memoir, biography, whatever. And I note that in France, for instance, there is often a much more elastic approach to that. Not always this very rigid categorization. So the work of a writer like Annie Ernaux, it's discussed in terms, it's referred to as text, text, rather than fiction or non-fiction, although Ernaux herself insists on its truth and its truth to experience, and says she's writing memoir. But you will find it in a bookshop. It sits there along with Proust and the translations of Virginia Woolf's fiction or anything else. So it's considered, a literary text. And I guess with this novel, I really did enjoy making that, I suppose, a bit more obvious, because clearly all fiction contains elements of truth. It might be research about a particular period or particular topic that the writer has done. Realist fiction relies on that particularly. And similarly, one could say that, all memoir or biography, aims to shape a life and give it form, and necessarily, leaves out inconvenient parts of the reality it's choosing to represent, or seeking to represent. So I think that's a very astute comment about the ways in which we are taught to keep these categories separate. I have a theory that in Australia, this is pursued and policed perhaps with more rigor than elsewhere, because Australia is founded on one great binary, which is, white or not white. And that is the foundation of the modern nation. So these categories must be kept separate, of course, must be identified and policed. So yeah, thank you to Mireille for that really productive question.
Well, thinking about Sugi's question before about impunity and innocence, and about the boy that gets away with the theft of a ring, where a Native woman likely loses her job and is whipped for it. And the way in so many of your books you make living in the patriarchy tangible and palpable, the menace of male violence as atmosphere, something you do in many ways we didn't explore today. But as an ending thought and question, I just wanted to say that I really love how you stay in this gap, how you insist on staying in this gap between the either or notion or impulse, between theory and practice. Like when you quote Aristotle as saying, theory increases knowledge and praxis is action for its own sake, where poiesis is the in-between, an action on behalf of creation. This book feels like poiesis in that regard, that as we unpack all the unsavory aspects of Woolf's life, we don't lose sight as we move through the weather and landscape that is misogyny in your books. We don't lose sight of the vital space Woolf carves out within her narratives, this place of interiority and sovereignty there that has been so vital for so many people. And it makes me think of the epigraph for this book by Ali Smith that goes, "My mother told me they'll want you to tell them your story," the girl said. My mother said, "Don't. You are not anyone's story." So now that you've written a story that is not a story, or a true story that is truer than any story, what does writing this leave you thinking about and perhaps wanting to write about now?
Well, I'm a slow writer, and it's a long time between drinks here. I am still thinking about where I might go next, and unsure, but possibly I will try to write something utterly immersive.
Utterly immersive.
Utterly immersive. Maybe, who knows?
I love that. That would be the least probable move, right? Or maybe.
Exactly. Exactly. Maybe. And maybe not. I don't know. I just, I hope it will be different from what's gone before. Adventuring, changing, as Woolf said. The death of the artist is really the beginning of repetition, is the death of the artist. Obviously, everyone has certain continuities of subject matter, but you have to try and find new ways of exploring that, I think, or you start to repeat yourself. And there are many great artists whose career testifies to that, sadly, So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know really. There are those sort of glimmerings in the offing, but I don't know. I might not write first person again, I think, because I might have to shift back to third. Although I have so loved writing in the first person. And, it was that commission to write a book about Hazard in this little Australian series called Writers on Writers. So that really got me writing in the first person. When I started off writing, I was really resistant to the idea of writing in the first person, partly because the most recent kind of editing I'd done was travel literature, which is always in the first person, you know. So I was just tired of that. I was tired of this intrusive person called I, who, dominated the page. And in English, even, the capital letter just seemed so, who is interested in I? And then also, I love the possibilities of the third person. That third person narration with a mobile point of view still seems to me a very, very satisfying way to write fiction, and that you can get beautiful effects with it. It's like oil painting or something, and it seemed like the grown-up way of writing fiction. Huh. But the child's voice has power too. And what you lose, of course, when you first start writing, or what you always lose when you start writing in the first person, is you lose that range, that ability to shift between various viewpoints in the third person. But what you gain is depth. You gain intimacy. You can create this very intimate voice. And I think that is related to the notion of truth telling as well, because we're used to testimony as a genre, aren't we? As a factual genre, to witnessing, to the speaking of what one has experienced. So the first person is linked to that in our sort of reading experience and in our memories as well. So I don't know, but I think maybe just because I need to change, because I've done, these 3 things in a row now that have first person in them, I need to maybe go back to the third.
Well, even though I like writers, I like some writers who are always writing the same book. So there's writers who that it doesn't bother me at all. But one of the most distinct pleasures of reading you are those gaps between your books and the leaps that you take to a new challenge. Whether you're going to write an immersive novel or maybe you're going to write a fantasy novel, who knows what you're going to write next. But it was so great to have you on the show. This book, I'm never going to forget Theory and Practice. This was such a wonderful book.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm always, when I listen to you, and then again today, just so grateful and admiring and appreciative of the amazing, astonishing amount of work that you put into these interviews, in reading not just the writer's work, but, all sorts of things around it. And I mean, they're wonderful interviews. They are really wonderful interviews. And, it's the best podcast I know about reading and books. So thank you for everything you've brought me. I mean that utterly, and I'm truly grateful. And what an honor and a delight to have been a guest on the show. I couldn't have imagined it, when I started listening to it 2 years ago. So thank you so much.
And strangely, Le Guin brought us together too, which is kind of this
and
nice.
Le Guin, yes, we were in part of her carrier bag.
Yes,
we're held in her carrier bag. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. We've been talking today to Michelle de Kretser, the author most recently of Theory and Practice. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength, makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. If you enjoyed today's conversation, consider joining the Between the Covers community as a listener supporter to help keep this quixotic endeavor going into the future. Every supporter can join our brainstorm of future guests, and every listener supporter receives supplementary resources with each conversation of things I discovered while preparing, things referenced during it, and places to explore once you're done listening. Additionally, there are a variety of other potential gifts and rewards, including the bonus audio archive, which includes supplementary contributions from past guests, from readings to craft talks to long-form conversations with translators, and even music. There's also the Tin House Early Readership subscription, getting 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public, rare collectibles from past guests, or a bundle of books selected and curated by me and sent to you. You can find out more at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Or if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elizabeth DeMeo and Elisa Ogie in the book division, Beth Steidel in the art department, Becky Kramer and Isabel Lemus Christensen in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the Summer and Winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank past Between the Covers guest, poet, musician, composer, performer, and much more, Alicia Jo Rabins, for making the intro and outro for the show. You can find out more about her work, her writing, her music, her teaching, her film, at aliciajo.com, ALICIAJO.com.